Waminjika, and welcome from the lands of the Wurundjeri Woi Wurrung people to today's CEDA live stream discussing empowering First Nations people through higher education and vocational education and training. My name is Sharon Braun and I'm an Associate Director of Programming with CEDA. Wherever you are today and wherever you work, live and play, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country we are meeting on. We recognise their continuing connection to the land and waters and acknowledge the stories, traditions and living cultures of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples on this land, and we commit to building a brighter future together. Education is pivotal to personal development, expanding critical thinking, decision-making and interpersonal skills. It broadens the scope of an individual's world and lessens the challenges they face in life. It is not unreasonable to think that we should all have the same access to education, whatever shape that takes for each of us. We look forward to having the conversation today around higher education and VET and seeing what are the hurdles that are still facing our Indigenous people and how we can reduce those. Following on from our live stream discussion last September, which focused on primary and high school education, today's discussion will examine programs which support Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to successfully move through their higher education journey and onto their chosen career path. We continue to build on CEDA's purpose to improve the lives of Australians by enabling a dynamic economy and vibrant society through examining issues such as Indigenous empowerment through education. We invite you to explore other social and policy conversations on these important topics at ceda.com.au. CEDA's website includes an array of resources, research and policy papers, live stream recordings, podcasts and opinion pieces, which pursue solutions that deliver better economic and social outcomes. Please take advantage of the opportunities to actively participate in today's conversation. Follow CEDA on Twitter at CEDA_news and add your comments and key takeaways using the hashtag First Nations. Put your questions to the panel via our Pigeonhole app, which is available just below the live stream screen window on your screen, or log in on your devices by entering the URL ceda.pigeonhole.at and enter using the password education. We will endeavour to ask as many of your questions as time allows, but to help us understand those with the broadest interest, please vote on the questions of others in the app. Please also take a moment at the end of the live stream to rate your experience of today's discussion in Pigeonhole. I would like to thank today's sponsor. Indigenous Business Australia has supported each of the sessions in our Empowering First Nations People series since its launch last June. IBA has been an active and engaged member of CEDA since 2019, and we thank them for their participation. I am pleased to be able to welcome our panel participants for today's discussion. Peter Chesworth, Deputy Chief Executive of Universities Australia, who has kindly stepped in for Katrina Jackson today. Dr. Leanne Holt, Vice-Chancellor Indigenous Strategy at Macquarie University and immediate past President of the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Higher Education Consortium. And Michelle Hurd, Managing Director and CEO of North Metropolitan TAFE in Western Australia. Thank you all for participating today. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our facilitator for today's discussion. Rodney Williams is a principal at Nous Group and brings a diverse industry experience across private, public and community sectors to today's discussion. Rodney is a former CEO of Career Trackers and has worked with Indigenous Business Australia, so is perfectly placed to drive today's conversation. Rodney, thanks so much for joining us. Over to you.
Thank you, Michelle. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land and the waterways where I join you from today, the Turrbal and the Yagara people of Meanjin here in Brisbane, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge that our participants in our panel today are joining from various parts of Australia and acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands in which you're all joining from today. I'd also like to acknowledge our fellow First Nations people who are joining us today. My name is Rodney Williams. I'm a proud Aboriginal man, a descendant of the Gull people of central Western Queensland. Born and raised in southeast Queensland with family connections to the Aboriginal communities of Cherbourg, Brisbane and right across southeast Queensland. As Michelle outlined, I'm also a principal consultant with Nous Group. Welcome to today's CEDA Empowering First Nations People session, where we're going to speak about higher education, vocational education and training, and and we'll be discussing university and non-university programs which support Indigenous students to thrive and complete education, while also exploring ongoing hurdles and how industry, institutions and policy can address these. It is well known that education is a critical factor for economic development and growth, and an essential component of an individual's employability, physical and mental health, and also earnings potential, benefits which flow on to families and our communities right across Australia. In thinking about today's session, I was reflecting on my own personal journey as a young Aboriginal boy growing up in the 70s and the 80s, having the opportunity to access a quality educational experience is something that I reflect on and think about where I've been able to grow as a person and also professionally. And one of the key pillars that I go back to is that opportunity for a quality education. You know, like many people of my generation, being the first in family to be able to complete high school certificate, being first in family along with my siblings to be the first to graduate from university are all significant milestones. Thinking about my mother's generation and thinking about our old people and not having the opportunities that I have and people today have is something that we certainly can't take for granted. But unfortunately, as we've seen increases in the participation in higher education for our young people, sadly, as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, we are behind the rates in which our non-Indigenous colleagues have access to education and complete education. And so whilst we've made some progress, there is still some significant challenges that remain for us, and particularly for our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that come from regional and remote parts across Australia. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today with our panel, and look forward to our audience also participating through sharing your questions, which we will discuss as a panel today. I'd like to now invite our panel to introduce themselves and to share a couple of minutes of their opening comments. I'd first now like to go to Peter Chesworth. Over to you, Peter.
Good afternoon, everyone, and hello from the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people here in Canberra. And always at the front of my mind, I'm in a new career, but for many years it has been the question of how we ensure that in a incredibly wealthy country like Australia, we can just essentially share the benefits of that wealth. And I'm also regularly humbled when I go riding in the outskirts of Canberra and I look in the beautiful mountains and the hills and contemplate that peoples on these lands have stepped lightly on them for 25 centuries. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. This here is the 2022 Universities Australia Indigenous Strategy that we brought together in partnership with our close colleagues at NATSIHEC. And before I say anything further, in speaking from a university's perspective, I have to acknowledge the massive contribution, complementary contribution and a partnership from our TAFE sector, because both parts of the education system have an enormous role to play in advancing Indigenous people's wellbeing and in enhancing Australia's wellbeing as well. So the Universities Australia had their first Indigenous strategy. It was worked on in 2017 and went from 2017 to 2020. And it was, again, developed in consultation and partnership with NATSIHEC as the key staff representative body for the sector, and in consultation with our 39 member universities. It was the first of its kind, and it brought all 39 comprehensive universities together. And it had a very strong focus on student access and participation, with enrolment success and completion targets. It also brought the member universities together in agreeing to the importance of Indigenous-led research and employment, and including Indigenous matters in institutional documentation and practice. I'm sure just one small example that everyone will be familiar with is more an open and public debate about how we handle bushfires in this country, and how Indigenous people have learnt to respect the land in partnership with the land rather than trying to dominate the land, and the things that Australia can learn from the thousands of years of knowledge in managing our land to reduce the harm that can come from it. There is a cultural journey that I think Australians have to go on to understand we can't beat it. You've got to work with Mother Nature. To monitor progress on the 2017 to 2020 strategy, we conducted an annual survey. Now, in the last survey, in 2020, we found that whilst all 39 member universities were participating, there were still, we got a lot of work to do. A lot of work to do on completion rates, and whilst Indigenous staff have grown within universities in recent years, again, a lot of work to do. We also have a number of universities that have to put in place their Indigenous strategy. There's work to do. So look, the overall message is there's work to do. Before this meeting, I reached out to my colleague, Leanne Holt, and said, Leanne, I haven't really done one of these before. How should I approach this? And her words rang loud in my ears. It was about reframing Indigenous people and knowledges as a strength. And I think that forms the basis of the new 2022 Indigenous strategy from Universities Australia. So we've had a little bit of a pandemic delay in releasing it, but it's out there now. It was released last Tuesday, and it was agreed by the Universities Australia plenary, which is every Vice-Chancellor in Australia. We had a lot of consultations, and the 2022 to 2025 strategy is built on 5 themes: student success, a university experience that fosters the successful completion of a degree and sets up students with favourable outcomes; staff success, where Indigenous staff recruitment, retention, promotion pathways, workloads, pipeline development, and professional development are all appropriately supported; universities taking responsible for Indigenous advancement, harnessing the evidence base and resources to champion Indigenous advancement within institutions; racism and cultural safety. Universities have to take a lead in actively implementing an anti-racism stance. And lastly, recognising the value Indigenous people and knowledges bring to the university and embedding Indigenous value systems and knowledges into university structures. The Indigenous strategy is available on the Universities Australia website. If you contact us, we'd be more than happy to provide a copy. Our chair, Dr. John Dewar, who's the Vice-Chancellor of La Trobe University, has stressed and put a challenge out to all universities that the success of this depends on a constant hard effort, not a launch and the report going into the second drawer. So we have a very active lead on Indigenous issues, Professor David Lloyd, and our wish is that you'll be hearing more about this in a sustained way into the future. Thanks very much, Rodney.
Thank you for that introduction, Peter. Welcome, Leanne.
Thanks, Rodney. My name's Leanne Holt. I'm Worimi Biripi woman, part of the Gurtung language group from the mid-north coast of New South Wales. And I'm coming to you from Darug Country at Macquarie University, where I'm the Pro Vice Chancellor Indigenous Strategy. I was just listening to Rodney's introduction, and I think it's quite common for us to reflect on our own experiences when we're asked to speak at something like this. And so I'm going to do a little bit the same, because I think our experiences are reflective of a lot of our students' experiences as well. And so unlike Rodney, I actually didn't finish year 12, and I had a bit of a low point at the end of my, as I was leaving. My last school report said I was wasting the education system's money and the resources of the school. So I often now use that as part of my PowerPoint. So it's when teachers actually could write the report. And now I don't think they'd be allowed to say anything like that. And so, like, you know, university obviously wasn't an option for me, and it wasn't something that I ever imagined. But I did go to TAFE after working for a number of years. I started doing TAFE at night, and I did a human resource diploma. And while I was at TAFE, the Aboriginal education officer there, Robbie Cohen, encouraged me to apply for an identified job. I think it's important that you recognise that it was an identified job, because I would definitely not be working in a university if it wasn't for the opportunity to apply for identified position. It was an Aboriginal identified position that I applied for. And when I came for my interview, it was the first time that I'd ever stepped foot on a university campus before. And so, but once I started working at the university, I found a real passion for education and an understanding of, and a clear understanding about how education can impact our communities, and what a fantastic opportunity it is for our communities to be able to engage in this space. But starting at the university, I literally felt like a fish out of water, and I didn't have a sense of belonging for a long time, or a sense of community within the university. So that experience has really informed my approach. But for the next 15 years, I studied at night. And I didn't realize that my TAFE diploma would actually give me access to university. I thought that if I didn't do year 12, the university was off the table. So I was really pleased to understand, once I started working there, that was an opportunity. And it made me think how many other Aboriginal people don't realize that TAFE is a pathway to university. And a very good pathway. And so I studied then, and I completed graduate certificates and masters, and then in 2016 completed my PhD. And I also tell you this story because my PhD was on the development of Aboriginal education policy in Australia. And last year I launched a book called Talking Strong, that talks about talks to the development of Aboriginal education policy in Australia. And one of the things in that book that was really important, and the book actually doesn't tell a story that I tell, it tells a story of our past leaders, educational leaders that were very much a part of that development phase in the 70s and 80s and 90s. And I'm really just telling their story. I was really privileged for them to share those stories with me. But what came through in all of their stories was the importance of a sense of community, and was also the importance of relationships. And so the relationships that we have with our communities, so that we continue to ensure that we're responding to their needs. Because we talk first in family, but we must remember that some of these students are first in community, not just first in family. And that's really hard for people to get their head around. And so connection with community is so important, but also connections with our stakeholders. And as the immediate past president of, and obviously previous president of the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Higher Education Consortium, I had the great opportunity to develop some excellent relationships. And one of those relationships was with Universities Australia. And during the time that I've had a relationship with Universities Australia, which is probably 6 or 7 years now, I've really seen a lot of advancement being done in those areas, and also with the Department of Education and NIAA, which was previously Prime Minister and Cabinet. Like, you know, a lot of advancement in there. And so, like, you know, at first they would come and talk to us only about Aboriginal funding and Aboriginal programs. But it's important that when we're having these discussions, that we're not just isolated to conversations that relate to Aboriginal specific programs. All education policies, agendas, and priorities impact Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students and communities. So it's important that we're a part of that voice as well, and a part of those conversations as well. And so, like, you know, I think that relationships is about sharing. It's about respectful reciprocity, and so it's only by doing that that we're going to continue to get great opportunities. And I have, sorry, Peter, I have to pull you up because I said to him the other day, I have this thing about issues being the word that constantly runs after Indigenous, that, like, you know, that we have a lead on Indigenous issues. Obviously we are here talking about those issues, but we also should be talking about the opportunities as well. So I really jump on the point that every time we talk about Indigenous, it's followed by issues. And it shouldn't be, because there's some great opportunities and there's been some great successes to celebrate. And it's important that we get a really good balance of those. And I'll leave it there at the moment, Rodney. Thank you.
Thank you, Leanne. You've shared some really wonderful insights already with us that I'm keen to explore a little bit more in this conversation today. Over to you, Michelle, and welcome.
Hiya. I'd like to acknowledge the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, on whose land I'm speaking to you from today, and acknowledge First Nations scientists, horticulturalists, engineers, and passing skills on through generations, which is really an important point, because as a TAFE college, we really need to be reminded and work with our community in the design of our services, our learning resources, and be kind of directed as to where we should be putting our efforts and how we best serve people and community. So I wouldn't be able to be part of this conversation today if it wasn't for one of my brilliant governing council members who chairs my Aboriginal Education, Employment and Training Committee, Mara West, as well as my director, Coolac and Jobs and Skills Centre, Kim Hansen. Kim and Mara and their team of stakeholders and committee members, they guide, they educate, they challenge me to make sure that that we really are, you know, questioning and getting information and feedback and guidance from the community about what we should be doing, where we should be doing it, and how we should be doing it. And in WA, it's a really exciting time to be part of TAFE and working with the community, because at the moment, we've got really strong Aboriginal procurement policy, which is creating and trying to increase opportunity for Aboriginal businesses to win contracts. We've got native title, through which employers are looking to really provide opportunity for local language groups. And we've got participation plans for organisations need to show diversity in their workforce if they're actually getting government contracts and buy local. There's so many policy things in our environment that are meaning that there are unique employment opportunities and pathways, and we need to make sure that we're not just working with students, that we're also working with supporting employers around that connection between skills and opportunity, and, you know, through recruitment, creating culturally safe environments, developing skills, onboarding, you know, so it's kind of a very exciting time. And I guess some examples of that are things like, you know, what we can put out and also get guidance about is things like MetroNet in WA, you know, like public infrastructure programs. We've got the Nala Biddy strategy. We've been working with WA Police because they were wanting to increase the number of Aboriginal officers in their workforce. And, our role is to develop skills and work with community and promote and recruit training opportunities. And, that's our job to do that. And so we can work with others who then will provide the opportunity for our graduates. But to do it well, we need to know exactly what are the best kind of learning strategies and what are the employability and skills needs and skill shortages that are going to provide opportunity. So what we found is we need to get involved with employers really early, and we need to get involved with community really early in the design of our programs, all of our programs really, because what we do enhances the kind of diversity and learning resources across every single discipline and provides a richer experience for all of our students. But we have definitely found that earlier involvement is important, and also that because there's more and more opportunities, at times we're getting students with higher needs, which means we also have to work in partnership with our community groups, whether that's health groups, housing groups, with Aboriginal corporations, to make sure that we are providing wraparound support to maximise student outcomes. And I guess another key element of that is really about the journey that our own staff are on, and referring to our RAP, of course, as well. We have cultural safety training, but we did some amazing training recently, and it was a 2-day intensive training. And what we were able to do, though, is to have tiers and tiers of staff involved in that all at the same time. And what that meant is, instead of like having people doing it here and there, our whole organisation kind of went on a bit of a step forward in really having been challenged about our white privilege and being able to really think about and work with our community around how we create a safe environment, how we kind of embrace culture in our delivery and our resources, and in the visibility of that in our campuses to make them welcoming. So, a lot's been happening for us, and we're still learning so much, but, it's been very rewarding. And I think that that the outcomes in working with employer groups like police, BHP, Rio Tinto, Metronet, education, has created that opportunity. I always say I don't have 1,000 lecturers, I have 1,000 recruiters. So making that connection to the sorts of business aspirations that students have is like very exciting.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you, Peter and Leanne, for your introductions and your opening remarks. I'll just remind our audience that you can participate in today's discussion by sharing your question in the Pigeonhole app, and also voting on questions that other audience members have put forward. We'll now go to one of the questions that have been put forward by Glenn Withers. Leanne raises the crucial issue of whole of life cycle support for First Nations students. Where are we on integrating school advice, careers, opportunities, outreach with tertiary counterparts? Leanne, we might go to you first.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. It's one that's been and it's one that has had a lot of focus and concentration on. However, I think that the problem is that a lot of the funding that goes into those relationships between schools and universities in relation to First Nations, to transitioning students into First Nations, transitioning First Nations students into higher education, and creating that awareness and that aspiration, and like we're building on the aspiration. The research shows that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students already have strong aspirations to go into great professions and careers, and it's just providing the right environments to ensure that those environments are conducive to their success in getting to those professions and careers. And there is quite a lot of money put into that from the government. However, it's short-term funding. So up until recently, it's been 12 months. It's been 12 months at a time. So what you find is these programs are not very well resourced because, like, you know, universities won't appoint people in a longer contract. They'll only appoint them for the term of the contract. So they're on these rolling 12-month contracts. So you get a lot of rollover of staff, and all of these things affect the effectiveness of such a program. And importantly, as I said before, the relationships that those staff have with the students and the schools. Now the government has just provided three-year funding after, like, you know, we sort of said that this isn't working. So now they've provided 3-year funding, which hopefully isn't perfect, because as we know, a lot of our Aboriginal programs are all reliant on the specific funding, which affects the longevity and sustainability of programs. But 3 years is better than 12 months. So I know at Macquarie, I ensured that we put a lot of focus on our school program, and we run a very comprehensive year 7 to 12 program. And last year, in the last couple of years where we haven't been able to do all of those programs, we've really noticed a difference in our first year student numbers coming in this year. And the only thing we can put it down to is that lack of engagement over the last couple of years, like that strong engagement that we've had and that we've built up with schools. So that it just goes to show that relationship with schools and school students is so important, is integral.
Thank you, Leanne. I'll invite Michelle and Peter. Is there anything else that you would love to add to that response from Leanne?
Yeah, I could just add totally that the relationship with schools is really important. We've been fortunate in WA, as I said, because we've also got jobs and skills centres, which are now co-located in many cases with TAFE campuses, and that plays that important role of connection. One of the things that we're really mindful, though, as well is, micro-credentialing and skill sets, speed to market are a really important issue, particularly as these new opportunities emerge as businesses are growing because they've won a government contract or there's another little boom in the resources sector or whatever. So for us, I think that agility is really important, and to provide it's not just people at the start of their career and in the pipeline to the rest of their career journey. It's for people throughout their lives who might be switching careers, or there's a new opportunity or a scholarship becomes available, or they can build on their skill sets. There's many careers that are only available as I kind of say mid-career. You have to be in the field as a technician or whatever for a number of years before then that career door opens, like health and safety or project management or scheduling. So a lot of what we do is also about trying to move people into these mid-career promotional opportunities, which then provides opportunity for new people to come in at the start.
Thanks, Michelle. Peter, is there anything that you would like to add?
Only to thank Len for such a fantastic question, because it's so multifaceted. In times when I, not really entirely sure of the current state of the issues that you raised, I'm going to go back on some previous experience, some near previous experience. I've only been with Universities Australia for a few months, and before that I worked in the Australian government. I opened my comments by saying Australia is a wealthy and rich country. I know there are some people who are in circumstances where it's not immediately evident, but I worked in the Defence Department, and to build, let's take, for example, a submarine. We need engineers, we need CAD/CAM designers, all provided by our TAFE sector. We need schedulers, often provided by TAFE and university. We need psychologists and psychiatrists, so that the people who are going on these submarines know what they're getting themselves in for, because I've been on one of them. It ain't great, let me tell you that. So all of that funding is not necessarily couched as Indigenous funding, of course. The Department of Defence has its own Indigenous strategy, but I don't know the outcome of that funding leading to the Indigenous outcomes. So in this forum, we can talk about NATSI, and UA working with each other and the great role that TAFE plays. But as well as that, there are so many other parts of, I guess, funding and opportunity that I suspect many of us are not aware of. And I think that is something that collectively we can work on over the next 2 to 3 years. And I'll finish by saying this. Workforce planning is something that some organisations do really well, and some organisations, in doing so, all they can see is the enormous gap that is presented. To build these ships I was talking about, the initial estimation in 2018 was 5,200 people. It's probably going to be a lot more than that. We don't have them yet. And those opportunities should be just as much for Indigenous people as for anyone else.
Thank you, Peter. And that's a great segue into our next question that we have from Lisa Chung. Lisa asks, how can employers develop appropriate strategies to engage potential First Nation employees in partnership with tertiary institutions? Leanne, we might go to you first.
Yeah. Given that Macquarie University is right in the middle of Macquarie Park, we have, for those who don't know that, it's a massive industry hub, and so we have lots of relationships with lots of industry within that, particularly within that area, and big industry like AstraZeneca, Fujitsu, Procter & Gamble. So, significant organisations that are all developing reconciliation action plans. Some of that is push from the government, because now if you want to get government tenders, it's expectation that you have a reconciliation action plan. So we do a lot of assistance in connecting people. It's important that as an organisation, again, you understand what the community needs are and how and what it is to work with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. What are the needs? What are the opportunities in the communities? And so getting a good understanding of that, and we work with the organisations in connecting them with communities so they can understand that. We work with them to put cadets in, and Rodney's background is a CEO of Career Trackers. We also work with Career Trackers and putting students through Career Tracker interns, but we also directly work with organisations in developing cadetships for organisations, and more recently, we've actually, going into that last question, we're actually looking at bringing all of our school programs under an academy umbrella so that we can actually connect industry to those school programs as well. And so that the industry can start developing a longitudinal relationship with Aboriginal students from year 11, 12 onwards, hopefully into graduate positions. Because one of the things that historically has happened is that there's been a lot of focus on lower level positions and not actually looking at pathways into leadership or in pathway or layering it so that there are opportunities in all different levels of positions. And so, we look at those opportunities, cultural safety training, ensuring that organisations have giving cultural safety training to their staff, so that when they're working with communities or when they have student cadets or any other programs where you have Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people coming into the organisation, that the environments are conducive to those successful relationships. I'll probably leave it there, Rodney. I think they're the main things. Yeah.
Thank you, Leanne. Really keen to get your perspective, Michelle, through the vet sector. Obviously, that close alignment between education and training and and industry is something that is front and centre within the vet sector. So really keen to hear your observations around how employers can develop those strategies to engage with First Nation employees.
Yeah, it is really critically important, and I'd like to do a big shout out to my Jobs and Skills Centre staff, particularly the employer outreach team, because they are amazing. We often find employers who want to diversify their workforce and they have opportunity, but they don't really know where to start. They have very low numbers of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander staff working with them already, and they don't really have strong links to the community. And so it's really great that some of my team can sit down with them and understand what the skills needs are. You know, they might be able to, for example, set up some scholarships that might be for particular language groups based around where the employer is located. They can also talk to them about, you know, how to reach out into community, what are more appropriate vehicles to use to attract skilled workers, as well as connect to our programs, which at whatever level, it might be a pathway entry level, a pre-app, it might be a jobs ready program, or it might be, you know, something about, you know, the higher level skills for people who are already in the field. So, you know, we love to kind of make that connection, and we do that in all kind of areas and all disciplines. But I think that working with our community, you know, with the advice of our Kulak Centre and our AWTC to kind of put the feelers out and help design the programs, and, you know, as well as working with employers, you know, we're sort of really getting some amazing outcomes, I think, in terms of really, you know, jobs for graduates and also, you know, growth of Aboriginal businesses.
Thank you, Michelle. We have an anonymous question. What would each of you see as the biggest ongoing barrier to completing higher education, and how do we start to address this? Peter, in your introduction, you spoke about this refreshed strategy that has been developed. I might go to you to get your insights first around what do you see as the biggest ongoing barriers?
Thanks, Rodney. There are many. From the Universities Australia perspective, it is about ensuring that our 39 institutions have that top-down commitment to identifying what the barriers are and trying to do something about them. I was struck by the issues raised in the previous question that Lisa Chump had asked about how we sort of look at what can industry do or what can universities do. And we tend to treat these great big parts of the national fabric as sort of like a single institution, but we know that within them, we will have those institutions, whether they're industry or universities, that treat this as an absolute top priority. And there will be those that may treat it as one of the many things that they do prioritise. But, you know, you're always going to have those that are at the cutting edge and those that are the fast followers. What I would like to see is we get to a point whereby our national institutions, whether they're universities or TAFE or industry, actually see strategies for the advancement of Indigenous students as a competitive advantage for the institution, that they are known for being a place whereby the barriers have been mitigated. Of course, they can't be removed completely. Otherwise, you know, there'd be no point in going and getting a degree or a TAFE qualification, would there? But we do know that there are institutional issues. The 5 elements of the Indigenous strategy that Universities Australia has published with the enormous partnership and assistance of NATSAHEC actually try to address the key areas of, I guess, the key barriers. And we're going to be monitoring our performance to to see where we are. This isn't going to go away. By the time 2025 comes along, we'll be looking at the results and having another look to see how we can improve things further.
Thank you, Peter. Leanne, really keen to get your perspective around any specific barriers that you see, certainly through your lived experience and through your professional capacity as a former president of NATSIHEC and your involvement in Indigenous strategy. What do you see as specific barriers?
Yeah, I think obviously there's multiple barriers, but a big one is just seeing universities as an opportunity for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students. As I said, I never imagined going to university, and I still sit here and go, what? I'm a PVC? What does that mean? But how did I get here? And so I think that it's not just about making something, calling something an Aboriginal program, but actually have it developed through a non-Aboriginal lens. You really must understand, how Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students' experiences and their values and their philosophical approach to different to their lives and their way of doing and their way of being. Unless we understand those differences, then we're not creating welcoming environments for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's students and communities. And so I'll give you an example. So a lot of our students, if you look at students at universities and you ask them, why did you come to university? University students will primarily say they want to get a good job, they want to earn good money so that they can buy a house and they can travel overseas and they can get all the luxuries that they aspire to. And that is true of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students too, but it's not usually their first answer. Their first answer usually is that they want to go into a career where they can actually give back to community, and that they can contribute to advancing our societies, and so that and that brings a different perspective to their journey within university. And so if we don't actually respond to that and actually provide an environment that allows for that to happen and allows for that success in that way, then students are likely to withdraw or to not engage with their learning. We need it to be also a sense of community within educational institutions, not just university, but other educational institutions are really important for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students. And so providing a community that of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community within this broader Western institution that's culturally affirming and that's intellectually engaging and that actually embraces and values Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander knowledges and experiences and practices is really important for students. And that's students that have diverse backgrounds, whether they have always grown up in community and are really embedded in their culture and in the knowledge of who they are. But you also have students that have recently found out about their Aboriginality and are on some people don't like me saying on a journey, but let's say on a journey of discovering their identity, which is quite daunting to come in because you're discovering your identity as a university student as it is. Then you're discovering your identity as an Aboriginal person, or even as an Aboriginal person now not in community, now in this new community, this new academic community. And that's quite huge for students to actually embrace. And so a strong community that's guided by Aboriginal values and principles and experiences are really important. It doesn't matter what the cultural background of students are, that's who we are as Aboriginal people. So whether we've grown up with our Aboriginality or whether there's students that are just finding out, they're trying to explore their identity, we're all Aboriginal people, and that's part of our history and that's part of our experiences. So how do we embrace that?
Can I pick up on something that Leanne said? Although there's a million things in that, there's so many good things, not to mention, of course, your amazing story of TAFE through to university, which I'm going to now quote everywhere. but I guess there's two things I want to say. One is I think that was like really strong feedback I got from, student groups that I engage with, as well as staff groups, about the visibility of our environment, and even things like our learning resources. Our nursing team redeveloped a lot of their learning resources because our students pointed out that there wasn't case studies that were being used in the delivery weren't about Aboriginal families, and things like that. So there's a lot of work that we had to do and are still doing to enrich our campus learning environment. But the other thing that I really wanted to pick up on is, I think that the point that you made, that's something that has come through to me lots of times through lots of people, about that importance of being able to give back to community and to serve community. But one of the things that creates a kind of like a challenge for me in that, because as well as delivering services and working with other employers, I don't want to be living in a glass house. I've got kind of 1,800 staff. And I want to make sure that I have a diverse and rich workforce, and that I'm employing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in all areas. But not every position in the corporate areas or in the academic areas is actually specifically serving Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander clients. So I would never meet my kind of have the diverse workforce that I would see us as needing and wanting if I could only attract people for those kinds of roles. You know what I mean? So to me, how do I say I want people in every single part of what we do, whether it's finance, student services, academic disciplines? I want to attract people into all spheres.
Rodney, can I just jump in really quickly and respond to Michelle? Because when I talk about, when our students are talking about contributing back to community, it doesn't actually mean in Aboriginal specific roles. Just them actually using their own experiences and lenses within these multiple positions is a way of contributing back to communities. And also, I was really privileged to be invited to a family graduation celebration of someone that I encouraged to go on and do a nursing degree on Friday night. And she was from a remote community and had just completed a nursing degree. And the thing there was about being a role model, that people coming into positions where there isn't a lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people working in these positions, being able to be a role model for your community is actually contributing to your community. So we often talk about you can't be what you can't see. And if we have people in roles of finance and engineering and CEOs, that is a contribution to our community.
Great.
Thank you, Leanne. There's a couple of points there that I think leads us into the next question. And this is a question from an anonymous participant. Leanne, you made a great point earlier about the lack of pathways to leadership. As an employer, where should we start in improving our response to this opportunity? You spoke in that response just now about being a role model, and you can contribute in many ways. Obviously, through our professional capacity, being in leadership roles means that we are able to influence and guide the decisions that are made. And so leadership exists in many facets. Really keen to get your view around what is it that employees can do to start improving those leadership opportunities.
Yeah, I think as you bring in, as there's different programs and around bringing students in to fill cadetships, or bringing students as interns, or even in graduate positions, actually mapping out the possibilities of leadership positions is really important, and encouraging the development of the skills and qualifications, having those respectful conversations that say, we see real potential in you. And and encouraging them to continue to developing those leadership skills, whether it be through further qualifications or whether it just be on the job training. As I just reflect on myself, I would never have seen myself in a leadership position. Even 10 years ago, I would never have seen myself as a pro vice chancellor. And so, like, you know, I think that it, like, you know, it all comes down to having the right people around you to be encouraging and to say, like, you know, you can do this. You have, like, you know, you have great potential to be a leader. So, so having those conversations, but also it's really important that organisations don't see themselves as saviours. And Rodney, you'll hear me say this because it was one of the conversations that we had when you're at Career Trackers, that, like, you know, if you're working with Aboriginal people, see that as a reciprocal relationship, that, like, you know, they have experiences and they have knowledge that they can bring to your organisation. Don't see it as your organisation is here to save these students, or to, like, you know, that you're going to be the heroes that are going to save the world. That's something that we do side by side and we do together.
Thank you, Leanne. Michelle and Peter, any final comments to add to what Leanne has just shared in relation to what is it that employers can do to support leadership opportunities for our First Nations people?
You okay if I go first, Michelle? Just very briefly, in the Indigenous strategy that UA launched last week, in the 5 priority areas, we've included a case study just to indicate what some institutions are doing to advance opportunities for Indigenous people within their institutions. In relation to advancement within institutions, which was, I think, the subject of the anonymous questions, there is a case study in there from University of Technology Sydney, UTS. Now, I don't want to get into, I'll start sounding like a bureaucrat if I get into the details of it, because it starts talking about key performance indicators and all that sort of guff. But what it shows is that there are institutions there that are looking very closely at how Indigenous strategy is embedded into the whole of university strategy, and how they are looking at ways in which faculty-specific Indigenous sort of action plans can be used to, I guess, apart from anything, ensure that Indigenous people get a fair go. Because in institutions, you just can get some institutional bias. And I think there's more than a tacit recognition that there are things that universities can do to overcome those.
Great, thank you, Peter. Michelle, before we run out of time, some further comments that you'd like to share in the last 30 seconds.
Yeah, I think employers, I'm seeing a lot of conversations around promotional skills development, so there's that awareness there. And Mara, my chair of my AWTC and Governing Council, hit me up as an employer myself to make sure that we're doing that kind of thing, as you said, Leanne, exploring like pathways and opportunities for acting, and, you know, how do we actually promote people within our organisation.
Great, thank you, Michelle. Unfortunately, we've now run out of time in our session today. It's amazing how quickly an hour goes. We could continue this conversation certainly for the rest of the day. Really great to hear the insights from Leanne, Peter and Michelle, and thank you to our audience for your participation through putting forward questions for our panel to discuss. Again, I'd like to thank our participants for today. Peter Chesworth, Michelle Hode and Dr. Leanne Holt for sharing your insights and expertise. I'd also like to thank once again our live stream sponsor, Indigenous Business Australia. Your ongoing support allows CEDA to continue to convene these important conversations, such as these on very key policy issues. Please take a minute before you log off from the Pigeonhole to provide your feedback and rank today's discussion. Finally, I'd like to thank you, the audience, for your time and participation in the discussion, and remind all of you that this discussion has been recorded and will soon be available via your live stream link and on the CEDA website next week for you to share with your colleagues and network. You can keep up to date on CEDA's program by visiting ceda.com.au and registering for the following upcoming events via the website. On the 15th of March, Women Who Lead, Advocating for the Vulnerable, and on the 7th of April, Why a Circular Economy Makes Good Sense. Please continue the conversation by connecting with CEDA via LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook, and enjoy the rest of your day. It's been my pleasure to host this really important discussion today, and thank you very much for your participation. Thank you.